And thank you everybody for coming. It's very strange to not be able to see and hear everyone. This is my first time in a webinar kind of setting. So here we go, and thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Alden Sargent. I earned my PhD in sociology at the University of Virginia in 2010, where I studied gender, culture, and technology. And since then, I've been working at Occidental College in Los Angeles as a director for the Center for Digital Liberal Arts in the library. I'm also a transgender man who came out and began socially and medically transitioning at 36 years old. In my professional life, I support faculty and students at Occidental in the use of emerging digital tools, methods, and technologies, as well as library resources. And at Occidental, I taught a course called Genders, where I had a seminar of first-year undergraduate students engaging in survey design as a means to develop quantitative literacy skills. So this course was also my way of returning to sociological studies of gender after a pretty long hiatus. And I wanted to center transgender and non-binary lives in this course. So in my experiences with the discipline of sociology all those years ago, transgender people, if they were mentioned in mainstream conversations about gender at all, were treated as kind of an outlier that proved the role that gender was socially constructed. So I wanted a different way to approach the field, and I wanted my students to be able to approach the discipline as potential researchers rather than as objects of analysis. So in my personal life, I've responded to nearly 50 survey research projects on transgender experiences. Some of these studies are medical, some are psychological, and a smaller handful are sociological. So I want to share today what I've noticed as a person who's interested in data literacy and survey design, also from the perspective of a research subject. So I hope by the end of the session, we'll have some new ways to think about how to construct gender-related survey questions. And my aim, despite these kind of virtual walls of the webinar, is that we can do this to some degree collaboratively. And I'm really so heartened by how many of you, from students to experts in policy and social research, have come to this session today. Because I know your approaches to this issue are going to move policy and academia forward into really important terrain. And I have the disclaimer, I'm not a quantitative sociologist myself. In fact, I'm working on an autoethnography of growing up as a transgender kid in the 80s. But I really believe that survey research is essential for social progress and scientific understanding of the world. So here's the outline for today's session. There's basically 4 parts to it. First, I'll go over the landscape of transgender data and the challenges associated with its collection. Then I'll offer some historical context on the construct of transgender identity. Next, I'll walk through the challenges of collection using some examples from the genders class that I taught, as well as from surveys that I've responded to via social media, specifically Reddit. And then finally, we'll try out a collaborative exercise using the collaborative notes Google Doc, which is linked in the chat. And I'll try to reserve some time at the end for questions and sharing links to resources, though I imagine the collaborative part and the Q&A might kind of all merge together if things work as I hope they will. I've color-coded these sections to help us kind of keep track of where we are in the presentation, and you may notice that incidentally, we've got the pink and blue colors of the trans flag and the yellow and purple colors of the non-binary flag to keep us oriented and on track. Okay, so why do we need transgender data? Social data about transgender people, I think, has allowed for a greater level of clarity, advocacy, and policy change on a range of key issues. And it wasn't really until the 2010s that transgender-specific data was collected and transgender inclusive questions became more commonplace in research. So there are 2 major surveys that provide almost everything we know about transgender people as a whole in the United States. The first of those was conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality and released in 2010. And it focused specifically on healthcare access and outcomes. And that data was cited, according to Google Scholar at least, 443 times by other research. So some of the key findings are 41% of respondents had attempted suicide. 4 times the national average had experienced infection with HIV. 19% were denied medical care on the basis of being transgender. And in 2015, the same National Center for Transgender Equality partnered with the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to produce the largest and most comprehensive review of transgender people's experiences of discrimination. So this study was 7,500 people, and it was a 70-question instrument. And this has been cited 1,428 times by other researchers. So some of the key findings there, 63% of transgender people experienced some form of discrimination, and 23% of the sample experienced what they called catastrophic levels of discrimination, so intersecting sort of 3 or more areas of discrimination. And discrimination in healthcare, policing, and prisons were dramatically worse for transgender people of color compared to white transgender people. So for example, 38% of Black respondents were harassed by police compared to 14% of white respondents. So why would we need trans-inclusive data on topics that aren't specific to transgender populations? And is that even possible? I want to introduce some of the challenges in collecting gender-inclusive data in surveys that aren't specifically about transgender experiences. And those 3 challenges are kind of grouped into population, time order, and diversity within the category of transgender. So in terms of population, the first question, of course, is what is the population? What is the percent of the population? And it's actually been sort of difficult to estimate, and only fairly recently that we have any numbers on this, because there's no national census of transgender people and no systematic federal collection of data on the number of transgender people living in the United States. So instead, what we have is an estimate from the Williams Law Institute at UCLA, which suggests that there's 1.4 million transgender people living in the United States. That's only counting adults. It's not counting children who identify as transgender, which is about 0.6% of the population. So this relies on the CDC's behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is a survey that examines a wide range of health indicators. There are a couple of other attempts to do this. There's another model, which is linked in the resources in the collaborative notes, published in 2017, that actually interestingly used a meta-analysis of surveys that included a transgender category in their data collection. And so they basically created a model to try to estimate in the general population how many transgender people are there. Their number came out to be more like 1 million. And another interesting resource, particularly if you're thinking about how to advocate for bringing transgender identities into federally collected data, or really in any research project. In 2018, some folks from the Census and Department of Labor presented their work on a focus group about adding transgender questions to federal data forms. And I think this is a really interesting model for how we could more effectively reach transgender respondents and create more inclusive federal data. So some of the challenges for the population size presents, as you might already imagine, is that when a population is 0.6% of a whole, and you're trying to make comparisons with other gender categories that are closer to 50% of the population as a whole, it makes it really difficult to identify enough transgender participants to make generalizable comparisons to non-transgender people. And I often wonder, how many researchers over the years have wanted to be more gender inclusive, only to find that they had to omit or recode the small amounts of data that didn't fit the binary male-female model. So one of the most confusing elements of surveys that I've taken is the difficulties that time order represents. I think particularly as somebody who transitioned at a later time in life. So survey researchers tend to treat transgender as a gender category that's like male or female, which carries with it probably an unintentional assumption that it is a sort of a fixed and enduring identity over the life course, when for almost everyone, they've had some kind of relationship to an assigned gender and a relationship to some kind of lived experience of that gender category, even if that experience is fraught. And so some transgender people have felt transgender their entire lives, even if others didn't recognize it or they themselves didn't have a name for it. And others may feel that they've lived as another gender in the past. Some people do feel that they're transitioning from male to female or female to male, whereas others don't identify as male or female, but as non-binary or gender non-conforming, gender fluid or gender queer. And this leads us to kind of the third challenge, which is a challenge of meaning. So sometimes when I'm taking these surveys, I feel like I have to consider existential questions when I'm trying to just answer a survey question about the meaning of my life and how did other people understand me at a particular point in time? How did I define myself? How did they define me? It gets really sort of complicated because transgender has different meanings that can intersect with age, ethnicity, political identity, beliefs about sex and gender. So for example, some transgender people would prefer to check the male or female boxes and not have to disclose that they're transgender unless it's really specifically relevant to that survey. Some people might exit the survey if they're presented with only female and male options. Some transgender people see it as an important identity and one that they carry with them. Others see it as a medical condition that has nothing to do with their identity. And so all of this variation within the already small percentage creates a lot of challenges in survey design. And to complicate matters further, of course, the experiences of transgender people, like any other social category, are intersectional. But I want to convey that I think it's still important, despite these challenges, to figure out new ways of asking about gender. So skeptics might say, okay, the answer choices of male or female are going to automatically exclude some respondents, but now you're telling me it's likely to be less than 0.6% of the population that's excluded because of all the different ways that people relate to gender categories and to the term transgender itself. But if you take the time to rethink this standard gender question, I think you could be more specific about your gender variable constructs, like what elements of a gendered social experience really matter to your research question. And I think we all have a sense now that the terms men and women are kind of standing in for a wide range of things, even for people who do not identify as gender nonconforming or transgender, that there's not sort of a total package where people feel that their sex, their physical identity, their social identity, and their gender expression and the roles they take in society all kind of cohere into this one thing that can be grouped together. So women may be breadwinners, men may provide childcare, for example. You can also be more precise with your gender-based measures. So what are you actually comparing? Like, do you want to know about discrimination that women face in the field of technology, or do you want to dig down into the gendered assumptions and behaviors that everyone is holding and encountering that are disadvantaging women? It's also possible that after hearing me talk about this, you realize you're not interested in gender at all. You just thought you had to ask this question because it's on every survey. And so you might actually be able to reduce the length of your survey by just taking that question out if you don't really need it and you don't really care. So I want to address another potential question that's on people's minds, which is, why is it that this population seems new? Like, where did this come from? Why is this something that we're talking about right now? So transgender appears as a term in the social science literature, according to Web of Science Index, starting in 1994, with publications in that area just increasing over time. I don't know, I'm mirrored. I think it goes like this. There's already as many articles this year as in all of 2018, and the number of articles almost doubled between 2015 and 2016. And one of the things that's notable about the population study from the Williams Institute is it showed the transgender population doubled in the last few years as well. So how is this possible? Some people have suggested it's related to the increasing visibility of transgender people in the media, increased access to information about transition that can be found online. And some have done so with intentions to affirm this growing consciousness of gender diversity. And others have sought to kind of cast this demographic shift as a trend or a fad, and further encoding anti-transgender bias into social science research, such as the study on rapid onset gender dysphoria, if that came across any of your media feeds. So I want to pause here then to kind of discuss what the term transgender refers to and where it came from historically. This is the part where I can get a little lost because I love history. So I'm going to try to keep myself constrained and stay on track here. There's a lot of other things I want to talk about today. The history of transgender research goes back to the 1920s with Magnus Hirschfeld and his Institute for Sexology in Berlin. So he studied thousands of people. And it wasn't just transgender people, it was kind of a study of gender and sexuality, and just, he was really interested in all the diversity of human genders and sexualities. And he also treated people in ways that we would understand now as sort of gender affirming care. In the 1930s and 40s, the Nazis destroyed all of that research. They destroyed the institute, they burned all the papers. It was essentially lost, and a lot of people didn't even know it existed until more recently. In the United States, the research was much slower to kind of take off. In the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot of developments after the World Wars, especially World War II, and trying to help people with reconstruction of the body and plastic surgery and things like that. So some of those developments were also incorporated into transgender healthcare. And in the 1950s, probably a lot of you would be familiar with Kinsey and his research, which was some of the most kind of radical research on gender and sexuality in mid-20th century United States. But even Kinsey didn't really get that much into transgender issues. He did some work on male to female cross-dressers and transsexuals. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, he condemned surgical transition. So he didn't have a particularly progressive view on transgender people at that time. So a lot of the study was framing transsexualism as deviance. In the medical literature at the time, most of the studies were being done specifically on one subset of people who were transgender, which was people assigned male at birth who always had a sort of an everlasting persistent feeling of wanting to be a woman and were sexually oriented toward men. Those were considered the only sort of true transsexuals. And everyone else was treated as somebody who had sort of a sexual fetish or some kind of sexual pathology. So a lot of the biological and medical research of the time is kind of building on these constructs that are pretty narrow and pretty pathologized. So in the 1970s and 80s, we've got the gay liberation movement. And as many of you probably know, homosexuality was removed from the DSM, Psychological Manual of Disorders. But then a new category was introduced almost at the same time, which was gender identity disorder. So the focus of the manual shifted from homosexuality to genders that were non-normative. And so over time, that idea became a new sort of way of organizing as well. So as transgender people were finding themselves at the margins of the gay and lesbian movement for being not good examples of sort of assimilated gay and lesbian people, transgender people began to form their own movements. And so that was people who identified at the time as transvestites, so people who dressed in clothing that was different from the gender they were assigned at birth, as well as transsexuals who had medically transitioned, and a whole range of people who had gender nonconforming identities, who didn't necessarily see themselves as transsexuals or as transvestites. And the term transgender was born in the 1990s as an umbrella term for pretty much anyone who was gender nonconforming or had some kind of gender nonconforming experience. And so that was a time when gender identity became really clearly distinct in the popular consciousness from sexual orientation. It hadn't been up until that point. Transgender became an umbrella term. And then also the realliance with the gay and lesbian movement came together so that now we have this acronym LGBT, but that didn't exist until 1995. And so more recently, all kinds of stuff has happened, especially in the 2010s. So the DSM changed its terminology to gender dysphoria, depathologizing transgender experience, talking about minority stress and the relationship transgender people have to a society that exhibits a lot of discrimination toward us. The Affordable Care Act included transgender healthcare, which is huge. Interpretations of Title VII and Title IX, we're including transgender people. And of course, social media is also expanding gender categories for marketing and analysis, like Facebook's famous 53 gender categories that came out in 2014. So these are some of the reasons or some of the contexts for kind of understanding this term transgender and where it comes from and the ways that these things change over time. So in terms of implications for research, one of the things to note is that scientific literature can potentially perpetuate some of these outdated constructs of pathology, and in the past has conflated gender and sexuality. Some of the problems that we face, of course, also is that most surveys have collected binary gender data rather than gender diverse data. And because of this history, transgender people may be difficult to access from researchers and may not trust researchers because of some of the ways we've been treated. So I'd like to now kind of take us into some examples from my course and from social media and talk through some of these examples from real life. So in my genders class at Oxy, Oxy is short for Occidental. It's our affectionate name for Occidental College. The course goals were to, so it was a freshman seminar for first year undergraduates. It was actually a writing course. It was part of a pilot for a quantitative reasoning program. So the course goals focused on variable construction, hypothesis development, critical analysis of data visualization, and critical thinking about the social and political implications of quantification. So the students' task was fairly simple. It was to pose a question, collect some data, analyze that data, and then draw conclusions. So as a class, we constructed a survey to be distributed to their peers. We did it in Qualtrics. And then as you see in this picture, we stood on the quad with iPads during a couple of class sessions. And this kind of went viral on the campus. And we ended up collecting 155 responses in a week, which was surprising to me. I was hoping we'd get 30 because the survey was really long. It took people at least 30 minutes to complete it and sometimes an hour. So I was really pleasantly surprised by that outcome. And some of the respondents said that they persisted in the survey because it was actually really interesting and it was getting them to think about new ways of understanding gender and their own gender. So these were examples of some of the kinds of questions that the students came up with to ask. So we were asking things about how do people relate to their own gender identity? How important was gender in different social contexts? How did people define that and relate to masculinity and femininity? And then some students were also interested in some things about like sex education and experiences with that, experiences with pornography, attitudes about what is male privilege, what is cisgender privilege. So cisgender just means somebody who identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. So we spent a lot of time in the class talking about how and whether to even ask this identity question using these gender categories. And initially the class said, no, we're not going to ask it. We just want an open response. People should be able to put whatever they want to put in terms of their gender identity. And they weren't really swayed by me saying, you know, it's going to be really difficult to code that. It's going to be really difficult to analyze. But finally, they were convinced because I said they would have to construct categories out of this information to make some comparisons. And so I started asking them, well, would you put all trans people together? Or would you put trans women and cis women together? And then if you did that, where would you put trans feminine non-binary people? Because they don't identify as women, but does it make sense to put them together with trans masculine non-binary people? And so what they realized in this conversation was that giving people discrete choices was actually more empowering for the respondent in the analysis phase, because a totally open response that's recoded later really takes that power away from the respondent about how they're being represented. So let me run through how the students address some of the challenges here of the population, time order, and meaning. So for population, we certainly had some challenges in our sample. We had way more female identified people answer than anybody else. And so what, in this example and in other examples, this is a student produced work. Remember, these are first years who have not taken statistics or survey design. They're in a writing class. This student eventually would go on to recode the gender identity data into cis men and everybody else, because that was how they thought about identifying meaningful differences. And a number of the students did that as well. That was how they were kind of coming away thinking about gender categories and what was socially meaningful. In terms of time order, that wasn't really a challenge in this class because we were only asking very young people, and we could create these kind of easily identifiable time periods like childhood before high school, college, and it didn't get more complicated than that. Where things got really interesting in this class, I think, was in terms of, this is another student example, in terms of this question of meaning, like what does gender actually mean to people? So when we were looking at these specific gendered behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes, that's where some interesting questions started to arise. So in this example, a student just decided to compare male and female identified people on what they believe is most important in defining a person's gender. Was it being raised as that gender, an internal sense of oneself as that gender, how your gender is seen by others, or physical sex characteristics? So my takeaway from this class is, given that this is, first years in a writing class, they were not expecting to have to do survey design or use numbers. They were very freaked out by this. It's not that this is like generalizable research, but it's kind of a way, like a creative way of using data collection to generate just new ways of thinking or different kinds of questions for further inquiry. And the students were generating questions I had just never considered before. So the other example I wanted to talk to you about today is social media and the ways that researchers are using social media to reach transgender respondents. So when I first went on Reddit in 2016 to try to find a transgender community and information about transition, a lot of researchers were using the platform to reach transgender populations. I've taken every survey I came across, including surveys on mental health, healthcare access, sexual violence, workplace discrimination. And often I would write to the researcher and thank them for the work and make some constructive comments about the questions. And initially, I would say like in 2016, comments from me and others in the forums were either ignored or they were answered kind of defensively, which I understand because the researcher had already, the survey was live. They weren't about to like start changing their constructs. And honestly, they didn't ask us for our feedback. And so it wasn't really going to be changed based on this kind of unsolicited commentary. But over the past few years, I think this has changed really dramatically, and particularly in surveys that are conducted by graduate students, graduate student assistants, who are using social media a bit differently to kind of test and iterate their survey designs. So I want to again give you 3 examples related to building trust and to time order and to meaning. So in this first example, you see a commenter who hasn't even clicked on the survey and is making a critique, who's just sour on answering surveys that have felt like they contain leading questions. And so what's interesting about this is that the survey researcher actually responds and adapts the survey in a couple of ways or clarifies the survey, and that ends up creating greater trust. And you see multiple people then chiming in saying, thank you for doing this, I'm going to take it now. And that likely is yielding a higher response rate because of that action. In this next example, you see a point of confusion about time order, about when did you come out? And the researcher actually steps in to provide some guidance on how to interpret the answer choices for this respondent's particular situation. And in this third example, this is a survey that just got posted yesterday. So now you know I was making my slides yesterday. But the respondents said that they exited the survey because they just don't understand the meaning of the questions. And I think implicitly, they're a little wary of the terminology being used here about sexual values. So I'm going to follow this one and see if the meaning gets clarified by the researcher or if this survey starts to get blacklisted by the community. Because one of the things that happens is if a survey looks suspect, people let each other know, and then people won't answer the survey. So I want to spend the rest of the time that we have together thinking about how can we ask these questions in a better way, because it's not a straightforward answer. I wish I could say, here's how you ask it, and this is going to work in every context, and that's just not the case. So what I'd like to do is, this is sort of an experiment, because I've never tried to do interactivity like this in a webinar. We don't have breakout rooms and ways of seeing each other, but let's try it and see how it goes. It could be a total disaster, but that's okay. So what I want to have us do, here's the instructions, is to jump into the collaborative notes document. And we can just share this here. So in the chat, you have the collaborative notes document. And there's also, let me pull that up and share the screen. So while you're getting into the collaborative notes, hopefully people are seeing the collaborative notes. Yeah, the scenarios for interactive portion. Oh, great. I see anonymous gophers and anonymous armadillos and cheetahs. This is very exciting. Click on your first name, A through F, and then see where your scenario is. And that will jump you down the page to the scenario. So take a look at that scenario and then claim a row. Depending on how many people there are participating, we may have too few rows. So if you need to add a row, what you do is I'm on a Mac, so I control click. If you're on a PC, you can right click. And you have this option to insert a row below. So just give yourself a space there if it fills up. And try not to click on another person's cursor because then that's their row and you don't want to type over people. This could be a total cluster, but let's let's hope it's not. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the instructions here. And you can add comments below the table to the scenario as well. And actually, I'll stay here in the scenarios. No pressure. We're all watching what you're writing. Cool. So people are in. People are participating. Fantastic. So I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I'm going to stop talking, so it'll be quiet for a little bit as we're doing this, and then in a few minutes, maybe we'll take 5 minutes or so, and we'll come back together and take a look at any of the comments that are there, and I'll try to provide some takeaways as well, which I've pre-prepared, so hopefully they're in relationship to the things that you're saying. All right, I'm gonna stop talking now, and we'll give you 5 minutes to take a look at this.
Jacob. For those who have joined us via phone, this may be an activity that is difficult for them to do. So maybe you could pull up one of the activities and they could think about it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for letting me know. I can't.
Well, that is a shout out to somebody else on the team, and I just was informed of that. So I think we are very excited about the activity.
Great, great. Okay, my computer is like wanting to crash, so hang on one second.
Do you want me to share it?
Sure, yeah, it's getting really glitchy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will share my screen, and then when you are ready to finish the activity, you just tell me to stop sharing. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to share my whole screen. People will see whatever there is there, so please bear with me. There we go. No, not that. Collaborative notes. All right, so right now I am going to show scenario 1 population.
Great. Jenna, could you zoom in maybe? It looks quite small to me.
Sure.
And for, wait, if somebody's on a phone, okay, but they're in front of a computer. They're not gonna see it if they're on the phone. Okay. And on your computer, you have view options near the green you're viewing, Jenna Tyson's.
Yes, yes, yes.
So you can also make it a little larger for yourself and remove my picture so that you have more space to see.
So hopefully this will be a good workaround for those of you who are on a phone or a smaller screen and cannot actually jump into the Google Doc. But if not, we will be sharing all of these materials at the end of the data fair, and you can go through all of these scenarios in your own time.
Let's take another minute or so. Okay, so I'm going to, Google Doc.
I think I will stop sharing at this point.
Yeah, okay, here's Google Doc. Somebody just joined, and Sophia, I'm sorry that it froze and you weren't able to participate, but hopefully you can take a look at those scenarios later. And it froze for me too. I think so many people in the doc, this is what we learned from our experiment. There's something like 82 people typing in a Google Doc might just be a little bit too much for Google Docs to handle. But thank you for those who were able to participate and those who were trying to participate. And I'm sorry that it didn't work quite perfectly for everybody. Let me go back here to the, to the Google Slides.
By the way, we have 7 minutes left.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And we have 2 questions that have come in. If you want to answer those now, or go ahead and do what you wanted to do. I'm not quite sure where you're going right now.
Yeah, so that's exactly, thank you for that. So if you do have questions that have arisen, either over the course of the presentation or in the activity, please do use the Q&A, and I can see them there. And I can offer some of the takeaways that I thought about in the scenarios. There were a couple of things I saw in what people typed that I hadn't thought about, which are really great questions, and great things I think to be talking to each other and people in your research communities about too. So I'm sharing my screen, right? Yes. Jenna,
yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So the first question was about, the first scenario is about population. Geez, I think I'd rather talk with people than like, you can look at this, I'll share the slides later so you can see what I think of the scenarios, but I'd rather hear from everybody else. So some of the things I noticed in what you said in the slides was that I hadn't thought about was the challenges of working with funders, and that funders have particular requirements for you to work with, and that had never occurred to me because I don't do survey research for a living, but that's so important. It's such an important structure to address. Like if there's going to be change, there needs to be an understanding at the level of the funding agencies to be able to allow for that type of change. The other thing I noticed in people's answers were how important gender is. And that's probably why you came to this in the first place. But for a lot of people, studying gender effects and their variation is really crucial to your research. I also noticed that there's just a lot of diversity in your answers too, that, you know, for some people, they would definitely use the same question, and other people are like, no, there's no way I would use this question. And so, and there's various reasons for that too, right? That depend on how you think about your own research agenda, what you're interested in, how you yourself conceptualize gender. So I think it's also really interesting to look at everybody's answers too. And then is there anything else? I'm just looking through the scenarios again. Yeah, and in the last scenario too, some of the challenges with the terms that are not necessarily all-encompassing, or like they don't necessarily express every possibility, particularly culturally specific meanings, particularly non-American centric meanings. So there's a lot of really rich stuff, and I appreciate your participation in that. So let me take a look at the questions. What data set do you recommend for studying the mental health populations who are both multiracial and queer? So I think I hit answer live because I'm talking about it now. Okay.
Yes, you can just go ahead and answer live.
Okay. Cool. That's a great question. One of the resources I linked in the doc below the scenarios, that major survey I mentioned, which you can actually find in ICPSR by searching transgender. I think it's the first one that comes up. It's the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. So they do break out these outcomes by race, and they use a multiracial category. And that was actually one of the really interesting things to me, was that for the multiracial respondents, they often had like more sort of severe outcomes than any other racial group. And I thought that was really interesting and definitely worth studying for trying to understand what are some of the dynamics there. And that survey is about discrimination. So it may not say like, this is a person's like mental health in general, so much as challenges with accessing care, but it would be a good place to start, at least to raise some of those questions. And yes, gender dysphoria is still in the DSM now. Answering this live 2. It's in the DSM now, and in part that's because both I think transgender activists and the medical community want to ensure that the transgender related medical treatment is covered by insurance. If there's not a way to classify it, there's not a way to cover it. So that's kind of the argument for keeping it in. Though certainly people are working at removing that as well.
We have just 2 minutes left, unfortunately. So if one of these questions would be something fairly easy to answer in a short length of time, that would be great. And then if for everybody who is attending, if you have more questions, I have posted in the chat box Jacob's contact information, and also if you go to the collaborative notes, there are links and additional resources in that document.
Yeah, thank you. And you can find me at sargent@occ.edu. I'll just say some things that the questions are raising. So there's someone who's interested in questions about gender euphoria as opposed to gender dysphoria, which is great. And another person who's a student is looking for places to collaborate with other sociologists who are interested in providing more space for LGBTQ women and people of color in sociology. So I hope, Alexandra, you can reach out to me at Sargent, SARGENT @occ.edu. And I think we're probably about out of time.
We are out of time, but keep your eyes open because we will be sending these slides out at the end of the data fair. And at the end of the slides, Jacob very helpfully has provided his contact information. And that's it for today, Jacob. This was wonderful and very thoughtful and thought-provoking. So I hope that everybody has a good rest of your day, and we will be signing out now. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.